Coming up, Iraq's political crisis.
Because we don't have a set of rules that the politicians are willing to apply, we're even more at the mercy of the individuals who are in charge. And our problem here is that the people who are in charge are really of a bad nature.
Iraqi lawyer Zaid al-Ali discusses his country's flawed constitution, incompetent politicians, and growing sectarianism. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is Zaid al-Ali, who will be discussing his book entitled The Struggle for Iraq's Future: How Corruption, Incompetence, and Sectarianism Have Undermined Democracy. For our speaker, Iraq is a very tragic and personal story. His family was exiled from there, and although he himself was not born in Iraq, shortly after the 2003 invasion, he returned to lend his legal expertise by helping to draft a new constitution. He also worked on issues related to parliamentary and judicial reform. He hoped that his efforts would play a role in rebuilding the nation. However, after spending many years directly involved in the struggle for Iraq's future, he left frustrated.
So the first thing I'll be talking about to get us going is the status quo, what's happening at the moment in Iraq. You probably remember that after the initial invasion in 2003, there was a deteriorating security, and things got very, very bad in 2006 and 2007. At one point, there was officially, the official numbers of civilian dead per month was around 3,000 dead per month. Around 2008, 2009, that was reduced significantly by around 90%. So it was reduced from around 3,000 dead per month to around 300. And it stagnated at that level of violence for a few years, from around 2008 all the way to around 2011, 2012. And now it's back on the up, I'm afraid. So we're not at the same levels of violence that we were at in 2006, but currently we're at around 1,000 dead per month, around 1,000. So, and the trend is currently negative. This has been a long time coming. This isn't something that has happened overnight. And we're suffering the consequences of problems that have been boiling now for a long time. The reason why, in my view, it's happened is because of two factors. The first is that we don't have any convincing or valid or binding rules to govern our country. And by rules, I mean a constitution or a legal framework, right? So obviously I'm a lawyer, so I'm biased towards legal issues, but I really think it's very important. We do have a constitution in our country, but the way it was drafted and what it says make it so that it's impossible to apply. The second factor, which I think is perhaps even more important than the first, is that the people who are in charge, so in any system of government, you'll rely on the rules that are in place, and then you'll rely on the individuals to implement them. You'll rely on the politicians to implement those rules. So in our case, because we don't have a set of rules that the politicians are willing to apply, we're even more at the mercy of the individuals who are in charge. And our problem here is that the people who are in charge are really of a bad nature, right? So we're really in a bad situation because the people who are in charge are very, very corrupt, are very incompetent, and are very sectarian. So let me talk about the Constitution and why it is that it's not in application today. Why, in my view, it's not being applied and why it cannot be applied. So we have two narratives about how the Constitution was drafted, right? How it was conceived and put together. The official narrative has it that first an interim constitution was drafted by a group of individuals who worked for the CPA. You'll probably remember the CPA from 2003, 2004. The CPA was the Coalition Provisional Authority, the civilian administration that was governing Iraq for just over a year, and that was headed by Ambassador Paul Bremer. The Coalition Provisional Authority, therefore the CPA, was also known in Iraq as can't provide anything. So the CPA drafted the interim constitution. And the interim constitution was supposed to guide the country towards the end of the interim process. And the interim process provided that a permanent constitution should be drafted by an elected assembly. We would have elections in January 2005. And the people who are elected would decide how the constitution would be drafted. They would either draft it themselves or appoint people to draft the constitution or nominate some of their own to draft it. And then those people, whoever it was, would then draft the constitution that would be put to a referendum in October 2005, and hopefully the population would be in favor. And according to the official narrative, that's more or less what happened. And then it was put to a referendum. That's the official narrative. And then the official narrative also says, and this is true, is that 80% of the population voted in favor of the text in the referendum. Okay, so and there's probably a little bit of fraud here and there, but more or less that result is accurate. That's the official narrative. There's another narrative about how the Constitution was drafted. Some people have alluded to it in writing. You'll have seen some of it. In Iraqi discourse, it's more common to hear about this than in Western discourse. I think I'm the first person to actually set it out in this much detail, at least in English. my version of events, and it's well documented at this stage, is that the official drafting committee that was responsible for drafting the Constitution during the summer of 2005, and that was working until August, was heading in a certain direction. They were producing drafts for around a couple of months. I collected all those drafts. I was working at the time for the United Nations as a legal advisor to a group of people called the Office of Constitutional Support, and we were providing direct support to the Constitutional Drafting Committee. So we were reviewing all the drafts and providing input and so on and so forth. So they were heading in a certain direction. The direction that they were heading in was one of consolidation of power for the central government. It was going to turn the system of government in Iraq to a more centralized system than what the CPA had originally intended. And it was also heading in a direction of less liberalism than what the CPA originally intended as well. They were going to give religion a much more important role than what was originally intended. Then what happened suddenly in August 2005 is that it was decided by the powers that be that the drafting committee should no longer continue its work, that it should cease to exist, it should be dissolved. The doors to their offices were locked, and they were told to all go home, and that they were not allowed to continue their work. And then the powers that be, which included 3 Iraqi political parties, the PUK, which is the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, and what was then referred to at the time as KIRI, which is the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution of Iraq. Those 3 political parties, as well as the United States Embassy and the United Kingdom Embassy, decided together that the Constitutional Drafting Committee should no longer continue its work, and that they shall take control over the draft, and they shall be responsible for putting together the final text of the Constitution. So the drafting sessions moved from the Convention Center, which is where the Parliament's offices are, and where the drafting committee was working. They moved from that, the Convention Center to the United States Embassy for a little while, and then they moved to the PUK's offices, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan's offices. And then what happened is not only did they take control over the draft, but they changed the direction of the draft altogether. Instead of following along the lines of what the Constitutional Drafting Committee had been going along, of consolidating power for the central government, what they decided to do is that they cut out all of the provisions that they had been drafted, they threw them all away, and replaced them with the TAL's provisions. The TAL was the interim constitution that had been drafted by the CPA. They decided that the system of government that we had drafted is good enough for them, this is going to be in the final draft, and that's it, no discussions, okay? It was a chaotic process. It was even disastrous at some stage. It was so secretive, no one exactly knew what was happening, that different negotiation sessions were taking place at the same time, okay? And at the same time without knowledge of each other, even. Now, the reason why I know this is because my office, once again, the Office of Constitutional Support at the United Nations, was responsible for printing and circulating the draft to the Iraqi population. Now, you won't believe it. So at one stage, one of the members of the Iraqi drafters who was working in secret came to us and said, here we are, we have the final draft of the Constitution, it's ready, please print and circulate it to the Iraqi people, right? We had a big budget to do this, it was several $million dollars, generally financed by the United Nations member states. And our response at the time was, our boss at the time said, well, how can I know that this is really the final version, right? All these negotiation sessions are taking place in private. We don't know who's responsible. We're hearing that different meetings are taking place. How do I know that this is real? They said, take it from me. This is the real final version, right? I said, well, we really can't because this morning we got a different version, right? So we have 2 competing versions. We really cannot, okay? Said, well, they turned to us and said, well, what can we do to reassure you that this is the final version? They said, well, what we would like you to do is to apply the terms of the interim constitution that's theoretically in force and to allow Parliament to vote, to debate, and to vote on it. They said, well, we're not going to allow that to happen. So, well, why not? Because a debate might lead in a direction that we're not happy with, so we won't let them debate about it. Say, well, will you allow them at least to vote on it? Said, no, no vote, okay? So how can we be sure that this is the official version? They scratched their heads for a little while. They said, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll take it to them, and then we'll read it to them, okay? I said, that's it. That's all. Yep, that's what we'll do. We'll just read it to them, okay? And that's what happened. They read it to them. The members of the parliament at the time said, well, don't you think we should be allowed to debate or to vote? They said, absolutely not. Session's closed, end of story, okay? Then the text was circulated to the Iraqi population in September 2005. Remember, the referendum took place in October, so just a few weeks before. And then even after the text was circulated to them, negotiation sessions continued in secret, and changes were made even after the text was circulated to the people. In fact, changes were made to the text 2 days, up to 2 days before the referendum took place. On October 13th, 2005, 2 changes were made to the draft constitution, and the referendum took place 2 days later, on October 15th. So when people turn to me and say, well, 80% of the population voted in favor, so therefore clearly it has popular sovereignty, my response is always, people had no idea what they were voting on, right? They didn't have the text that they were voting on. And even if they had, as you know, all over the world, when referenda take place in relation to constitutional issues, people tend not to read the text that they have. In Iraq, even if they had read it, it wouldn't have been the final version anyway. So the problem that we have in our case is the text was drafted in a secretive process that was absolutely not democratic, right? And on top of that, it established a system of government that was far removed from what is accepted in Iraqi political discourse. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that in Iraq, traditionally, we have a very centralized system of government. Right or wrongly, that's always been the way it's been. So people have always accepted that way of doing things, apart from in the Kurdistan region, which has been autonomous now since the 1990s and have enjoyed their autonomy for a while, and there's no prospect of that changing anytime in the near or distant future, rightly so. Now, in the rest of the country, however, in the 85% of the country outside of the Kurdistan region, people have long lived and have become accustomed to a centralized system of government. Now, after the war in 2003, many people argued that Iraq should be federalized. Now, there are different forms of federalism. Obviously, federalism in the United States is very different to Canada and to Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So the question was, what type of federal system of government should we be having, right? If it's going to be federal, in what way? Some people argued that it should be ethno-sectarian, that we should have 3 states in Iraq, one Sunni, one Kurdish, and one Shia state. Many people argued that that would lead to the breakup of the country and that they were not willing to head in that direction. So the question was, who would win in that argument and who actually constituted a majority in that argument? So it turns out that over time, we now know today, after 10 years, that a large majority of the population rejects ethno-sectarian federalism, a large majority, okay? A very large majority of the population. We know this on the basis of opinion polls that have been taken by American, European, Arab, amongst other polling companies over a 10-year period, which have all returned the same results on a consistent basis. And we also know this on the basis of electoral results, right? So the political parties that have campaigned on an ethno-sectarian basis, that have argued that Iraq should be divided along ethno-sectarian lines, have suffered terribly in elections, right? And those parties that have argued on the basis of a more national perspective, of one of where Baghdad should have a more important role in determining policies and so on and so forth, have done much better, okay? So we know that based on 10 years of experience. But in 2005, there was only one election, which was very opaque. The results weren't very telling at all. So who decided what type of system of government we would have? So the elections took place, as you know, as I mentioned, in January, and the elected representatives of the people were drafting a text, and they decided, the elected representatives, that we would have a system of government that would be more centralized. But then, as I mentioned, it broke down. The Constitutional Drafting Committee was dissolved and replaced by this opaque, secretive process that took place first in the American Embassy and then in the PUK's offices. So who were the 3 parties that were in favor of, who were actually in control of the drafting process at the time? I mentioned before, the PUK, the KDP, and SCIRI. Those are the 3 parties that are mostly in favor of ethno-sectarian federalism, okay? So it so happened to be the case that these 3 parties were also heavily allied with the United States Embassy. So I can't specifically tell you what they were thinking at the time, whether it was conspiracy or not conspiracy or whatever. That's not really my issue. But what I do know is that these 3 parties today, together, SCIRI, PUK, and KDP, all 3 of them together, represent less than 20% of the population, okay? Based on 10 years of polling data, electoral results, and so on and so forth. Less than 20% of the population. And their vision of ethno-sectarian federalism lies far outside what's accepted in the rest of the population. Far outside, okay? And these are the people, these are the parties that were in control of the drafting process in 2005 as a result of many factors, including the fact that they were heavily allied with the US Embassy at the time, okay? So what does that mean? They established an ethno-sectarian federal system of government for our country, and then elections take place. The new elected government decides, we're opposed. We don't like it. We're not going to apply it, they say. Because if we apply it, we consider that the country will break up. So we will not apply the system of government, which is good because I agree that if it had been applied at the time, it would have led to disaster. But the problem is that by not applying the text, is that we're left with no rules, right? So no constitutional text to apply. So nothing to bind the country. Instead of taking the text and saying we're not going to apply it, so therefore let's draft a new one, they decided let's not draft a new one, let's not revise it. Let's just pretend as if we don't have a text at all. Okay? So there are two problems with that. One problem is that when you decide not to apply the rules, a certain number of rules, and you can decide not to apply any of them. You decide not to apply the system of government. What about due process? What about fundamental rights? What about judicial independence, et cetera, et cetera? None of those rules are binding anymore because you've decided that some rules can be applied and others will not be. And the second problem, therefore, is that you're left completely at the mercy of your politicians, of the people who are in charge. Now, who are these people that are in charge? Where do they come from? What are their backgrounds and what type of people are they? Almost all of the people that are in charge are former exiles. Now, I essentially grew up in exile. My father was prominent in the exile community, and I grew up with a lot of these people, principally in London. So what type of background do these people have? The summary is that the former exiles in London and other countries that they were based in essentially spent their time doing nothing, okay? Unemployed or underemployed, living off the state, off employment benefits and that type of thing, and not being allowed to work because as an exile, you're not supposed to be working. You're not supposed to be fully employed doing, being a doctor or an engineer or that type of thing. So they spend their time in London, this being political party hacks. And what that meant essentially is that level of activity was close to zero. You would just go to the various meetings. You wouldn't really do anything apart from helping new exiles arrive from Iraq, and that's it, okay? If you were a doctor back in Iraq, you would not be a doctor in exile. If you were an engineer, you would not be one in exile, et cetera, okay? So you spent a lot of time, decades even, doing nothing. al-Maliki left Iraq when he was still a young man, without a university degree, moved to Iran, where he lived for 10 years in a military camp, not doing much, 10 years of lack of achievement, and then moved to Syria, where he lived for 10 years, where all he was doing was being involved in political party affairs, meaning going to the meetings and helping new arrivals and that type of thing. That's it, okay? So, and then goes back to Iraq, and then suddenly is prime minister, okay? So never having worked for the state in an official capacity and not really having any professional training at all. That's one of the qualities that they had. Another quality that they have is that when you live in exile from an Arab country, particularly from Iraq under Saddam Hussein, you really live a very difficult existence in the sense that anyone could be mukhabarat, anyone could be secret police, right? So any of the people that you meet when you're in London or Syria or Iran could be representatives of the secret police, of Saddam Hussein's secret police. And that's a very terrifying experience because the secret police were very pervasive. They were everywhere and they would really terrify people. So what that meant is that you always had to be extremely cautious of anyone that you met, okay? So as an Iraqi, if you're living in Baghdad and you grow up in Baghdad, Baghdad is a very diverse place. So historically, there's a very rich culture, as you probably know. It's very, very diverse from a religious, ethnic, linguistic perspective. There are lots of languages in the city, et cetera, et cetera. But when you live in exile, that changes suddenly, right? Because when you're living in exile and you're in political party exile, then the only people who you can really, really trust are the people in your political party. And that's one of the reasons why you may have noticed this. I don't know if you have. But exiled Iraqi communities tend to be very extreme in terms of their visions of ethno-sectarian relations for Iraq. But when you go back to Iraq, you'll find that the same members of those same ethno-sectarian groups tend to be very relaxed. Now, I'm going to conclude on this one thought. So I've mentioned that we have two problems. The two problems are the absence of rules and the absence of convincing politicians to guide our country. So we need to resolve both problems. But realistically, over the short term, replacing the politicians will be very difficult because they have deeply entrenched roots now in the state. They've set up businesses and companies and private armies and so on and so forth. What's more realistic, but still extremely difficult to achieve, is to improve the set of rules that we have, right? So I say this, and I realize that some people would say that it's naive because the only way that you can change the rules is if the politicians accept for them to be changed. But in Iraq, it's more complicated than that because civil society does play an important role. And when I say civil society, I don't mean NGOs, the NGO community, and this type of thing. What I mean is important public intellectuals. What I mean is religious institutions. And what I also mean is the international community, right? These different groups of people have a very important role, and they have played a positive role in relation to specific issues, right? So the electoral law in 2005, this as one example, was in a very bad state in 2005 and was improved in 2010, not as a result of the Iraqi government's insistence, but because the Marja'iyya, meaning the religious institution in Najaf, insisted that it should be improved. So my proposal for Iraq is that we should move from these punctual interventions in relation to specific policy issues to a more comprehensive plan, and to try to enforce as much of that plan as possible on the Iraqi political class. Even if only a small percentage of the ideas that we develop are implemented, then already represents a significant improvement. But we really need to work on it, and we'll be working on it for the next few years at least.
On balance, would the Gulf, the Middle East, Iraq been better off had that war not been started?
In relation to whether or not the war was a good idea, whether it should have happened, and so on and so forth, that's a very difficult question to answer because it depends on your perspective, right? So the previous regime, I mean, obviously, my family suffered very terribly under the previous regime. My father had a very tough time, and his relatives back in Iraq had a very tough time. So we're very realistic about the type of regime it was. It really depends on what type of issue you're focusing on. If you focus on economics, then in Iraq today, you're much more likely to have a decent living or a decent wage than you were before. From an economic perspective, things are better. If you look at things from an issue of rights and basic freedoms, then things are also better. So under Saddam Hussein, I don't know if you know how bad it was, but it was really terrible. You could really not say anything. You couldn't say a single word that wasn't approved, right? Not even in the comfort of your own home. So basic freedoms are certainly a lot better. You can say whatever you want now. There's no limitation on what it is that you can say. You can go about your business and so on and so forth. But in terms of security, there's no question that things are much worse. It's much, much worse. There's no question. Before the war in 2003, if you weren't involved in politics, if you were involved in politics, then obviously you were not safe. But if you were not involved in politics, then essentially you could go about your business with almost no problems. You could leave your home at 3 in the morning, go for a walk, come back, and you would have no problems whatsoever. In summer in Iraq previously, when it got very hot, people would sleep on the rooftop, because there was a breeze and they would get this nice breeze on the rooftop. Nowadays, no one does that because they're afraid that they could get bombed, by accident. They're afraid of getting kidnapped. They're afraid of getting blown up by accident. It's extremely dangerous now for just about anyone. The last time I was in Iraq was just a few months ago. I was there with my son, who's 2. It was very dangerous. We were very concerned about his safety when we were there. There were at least 2 or 3 bombs very close to us, not at a distance, every day while we were there, even in a small town that is not divided along ethno-sectarian lines. If you look at the refugee population in Iraq, over 10% of our population has now become refugees. Up until Syria, it was the worst refugee crisis in the world, in which the Christian population in Iraq is far overrepresented in the refugee population, mainly as a result of the fact that no one protects them, right? So if you're from a Muslim background, then traditionally in Iraq you have a tribe to fall back on, whereas Christians don't have that type of background. There's no tribal structure amongst the Christian population in Iraq.
How do we teach people to have a respect for the law? And how do you develop a culture, a constitutional culture in a country?
My answer to that is that's not something that you need to teach anyone. What you need to do is you need to change the law, right? The reason why I say that is because Iraqi law is not developed along equitable lines. There's no equity in Iraq. Our legal system is inequitable, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not something that people would be happy to apply. And the reason why I say that is because in Iraq, people do tend to apply the law. Iraqi officials do tend to apply the rules. The problem is more not the fact that they don't apply the rules, it's that the rules themselves are deeply flawed. I'll just give you one example. Do you know what you need to do in Iraq to renew a visa? My wife, for example, isn't Iraqi. My wife is Canadian Lebanese, right? So when she comes to Iraq, she gets a visa for 10 days. In order to renew her visa past 10 days, just as a visitor and someone who's married to an Iraqi citizen, she needs to have an AIDS test done. And this doesn't just apply to my wife, it applies to everyone. It applies to, for example, a journalist for the New York Times. If you look at things like torture, I didn't mention this in the presentation, torture and abuse in detention, there are no rules in Iraq to hold police and security officials accountable for abuse in detention. There are no rules. It doesn't happen because they're not applying the rules. It's happening because there are no rules about these things. If just on one occasion in Iraq, a law was passed, an equitable law in relation to abuse in detention, that provided that there was going to be a very serious oversight mechanism, and they applied it on just one occasion on a security official that tortured someone in detention, and they made a big deal about it, public deal about it, and did it publicly, you can bet your bottom dollar that at least 90% of police officers and security sector officials who regularly torture officials will stop doing it so immediately. You set examples of people. And you talk about, for example, respect for law and so on and so forth. The individuals in the United States Americans, who've always grown up in America and born in America and respect the rules in the United States and so on and so forth, when they were in Iraq as soldiers and so on and so forth, many of them behaved according to a very different standard of behavior. Many of them. Why? Because there were no rules to guide their behavior. They felt that they could get away with anything. Many of the individuals who in Abu Ghraib, remember in 2004 the scandal that took place in Abu Ghraib, the torture scandals and so on and so forth, many of those individuals who were there at the time, people who were torturing Iraqis, Americans who were torturing Iraqis, were responsible for prisons here in the United States. They were prison guards here in the United States and moved to Abu Ghraib and then started behaving in this appalling manner. If you asked many of them, why did you do this? They would say, because we thought no one was watching. Right? They thought they would get away with it, right? They thought this is normal, in a country like Iraq, it's okay, right? So my answer is yes, you do need to teach people to do, to behave according to a certain standard, whatever. But even before you do that, you really need to make sure that the rules that they're going to be applying are equitable. You need to really make sure that that happens. And that's a very difficult process in a country like Iraq because the people who are in charge, the elites, who we really have no control over, aren't interested. So we really need to find this balance of bad people and bad law.
Well, I thank you very much for refocusing our attention on Iraq. It really was an eye-opener. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.